And we're live. Welcome back, everyone. Craig and Midnight here today. How are you today, Midnight?
I'm doing fine, thanks. Yeah, just chilling. I'm glad to have another live stream with you.
Yeah, we had a few technical difficulties that delayed us. StreamYard, I love StreamYard, but it's super expensive, and so for this channel at least, I only have the free version, and it's annoying. You can't use the same link each time, and you can only stream to one channel. So you just have to bear with us. I'll hopefully remember next time. And we had been live streaming on Fridays, but we might try Saturday mornings for a little bit, just because I'm in the CrossFit Open and I work out on Fridays when we would normally record. So thanks for accommodating me.
For sure. No, I'm fully in support of your mission to build muscle and give Tim Gordon and Mikey Pantyhose a run for their money.
Yeah, I don't think I could outlift Pantyhose, but I've never seen Tim Gordon do anything, but judging solely from appearances like we're supposed to do, I think I could take him at most things.
Yeah,
maybe not a foot race, but
yeah, Tim Gordon does seem pretty pretty thin and maybe not as built. But yeah, Mikey Pantyhose has more to compensate for.
I've only seen him deadlift, so he's definitely got a better deadlift than I do. I don't know if he does any Olympic lifting, so if we had to do snatches and power cleans, I might be able to take him unless he does that. But so
I'm pretty confident you could take him in bear wrestling too. I think you could wrestle a grizzly down into submission.
Yeah, I kind of got that grizzly bear physique, so if it ever comes to that, we'll have to make sure we get it on video. So,
yeah.
Hey, Adam, good to see you. Our friend from the UK, I think, is chiming in. So I don't know if I guess it's in the middle of the afternoon over there. So
yeah, they're what, 7 hours ahead, maybe. That would be my guess.
So he's over there sipping tea and enjoying a little American blabbering. So. What's the topic? So the topic today is suffering in marriage, I guess, and it's kind of a recurring topic, only because there's always this tension between those people or those of us that find marriage is always going to be a struggle, I think, in some respect, just because you have two people coming together with very different lives, different biological realities, in just a complicated world. But then you throw on the rules, so to speak, and it sometimes seems to be an even greater challenge for the marriage than just the physical and normal emotional realities. And so we want to talk about that, because the common response to those that say, well, these rules are hard or difficult or wrecking my marriage is, well, life is suffering, offer it up, your Lord died on the cross, so stop whining about it, is sort of the response that you get. Or even worse, it's good for your marriage. Embrace that. And that's I don't know about that.
Yeah, you summed it up beautifully. It always just boils down to those cliches about offering it up, or it's good for you, or this is the way it's supposed to be, or mortify the flesh and all of that stuff. And it's not that there's no truth in that, there is, but I think the issue is with proportion. And I think a lot of these discussions recently have been, our friends in the Discord reporting various things on Reddit or Facebook with NFP struggles and husbands and wives either getting shut down or the posts being blocked, and your default setting is just supposed to be suffering regardless of whether or not the marriage is actually flourishing.
Yeah, and this, I mean, my feelings on this have evolved over time. Certainly are different than when I was a trad. Although when I was a trad, I was blissfully single and ignorant of what married life was like and what following the church's rules was actually like. But I'm trying to find an analogy that would make sense, and it's sort of. For me, I was thinking, like, let's just talk about the life of the Christian or life of the Catholic. Life does have difficulties. and but our prayer life, our sacramental life, whatever, and even it's in Lent. We're doing certain levels of penance. Some probably are taking it more seriously than others, but those things are kind of there to help orient us and replenish, if you will, our supply of grace and enable us to face and respond in a holy way to the challenges that life and other people present to us. So I think that, and so for me, I think that in marriage, that intimate bond between a husband and wife, most notably in sort of their physical relationship, is kind of that source of reset and grace, if you will, and replenishing and resetting and reconnecting, so that individually and together they can face the challenges that life and children and all that presents. And when that sort of that nucleus, that engine, if you will, of the relationship is in and of itself a cause of suffering, and tension and dysfunction for reasons of choice. Let's not leave aside for a second people, let's say, for like physical impediment or medical conditions, literally can't. But if we're being honest, most of the stuff that people we subject ourselves to as Catholics are by choice. Now, we're told do this or don't do that, so it is a choice. It's a decision, and I think it's a real problem when couples do not have that place of refuge in their bedroom and their physical lives, as well as emotional intimacy, but they tend to go hand in hand. And I just think, we should not be so dismissive of how important and valuable that is, and on the other side, how deeply damaging it can be to the marriage when that part of their life is constantly under attack by decisions of our own making, right?
Yeah, because it takes what should be the safe space of a husband and wife, and kind of you create an atmosphere of hypervigilance, and you're just constantly under surveillance, and you can't really relax into your own your intimate space with your spouse.
Yeah. If you're on social media at all, and of course this is more from a secular, or at least not necessarily religious perspective, but you always see these, at least I do, maybe it shows up in my feed, but my husband's had a bad day, so the wife is there greeting him at the door, and she pulls off her towel or something, and that just fixes things. Like that, there's just something about that. And of course you could, I guess, in theory, do that even if you're in a situation where you have to abstain from the full marital act. But the full marital act is that great reset. It's that great connection, that great ability for the couple, even when you're not trying to procreate, that is just seems to be by design, not by concupiscence or fallen nature, like a lot of the trads, or at least I don't know if you think a lot of the trads follow that, but let's say the real trads, the Augustines and people like that, seem to want to paint a very negative picture of it for one reason or another.
Yeah, they these hardliner folks, they seem to have no faith that life without us adding anything is already quite difficult. We don't. Yeah, I think even normal people that they don't necessarily practice faith, or they're not part of a religious community, they have their own plate of difficulties. We don't really need to add another thick layer of anxiety on it.
And when you consider the fact that at some point in time, most married couples are not just responsible for themselves, but they're responsible for new people that they've created. And I just tell you from lots and lots of experience that when your marriage is under duress, if you will, for these reasons, it makes it more difficult to encounter and deal with the difficulties of life, the uncertainties of work and finances, and then to come home and your kid is sick, or whatever, they're not doing well in school, or they're going through behavioral problems. It's just so much more difficult to be there to meet them in a good parental way when you feel like you're kind of empty yourself. And that's a real thing that I think gets also gets overlooked and dismissed, and like, oh, just have more kids, it'll that'll just make everyone's life better. Well, I mean, I don't know if that's true or not. It's certainly not true all the time or for everyone.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that the difficulty too with this particular approach with the trads is that exhaustion also comes very much in the form of like mental strain, because you're constantly thinking or calculating your the state of your soul, and having to stay in
Yeah.
these rules, and in some ways, um, I think that added layer of suffering is well, I mean, you know how it is, like mental strain can sometimes be more exhausting than just like the physical work of raising kids and running a household and going to work and making sure ends meet. I mean, that's already tough on its own, but I think when your mind is just constantly thinking in this loop of anxiety, that like magnifies your default level of exhaustion.
Yeah, that's it's so true. And I don't know. I don't know what the ultimate solution is, but at a bare minimum, it would be nice if we could just stop being so dismissive of people, and sort of get rid of this, I don't know, righteous indignation that seems to come with it. And so yeah, so that's the if you go to Reddit, it's just a recurring thing. And I feel especially bad for the converts who come to the faith, and I think are often, well, I don't know, I guess, again, like I said, I grew up, I'm a cradle Catholic, kind of a revert, but we never left the church or anything, but then we became increasingly more conservative and traditional, if you will. But until we were married, until kind of the rubber meets the road, it's really, really hard to understand and appreciate what life is like for some people. And I'll be the first to say, I have it a lot easier than a lot of people. We have haven't dealt with medical conditions that, let's say, required long-term abstinence. We haven't, we've NFP has been more or less effective for us if we were just a little more rigorous about it. There's a lot of people that isn't the case, or they're, and we've been largely healthy, and I've always been able to provide for our family, and we've been, largely stable in that respect. So, everyone's situation is different, and your backgrounds are different. I came from a pretty stable household. Wife, I think her parents had a little more of an acrimonious
Mhm.
relationship, but they were, married, and spent their kids to Catholic school and all that. But everyone just has just different things going on, and that doesn't mean that we should make everything relative, I don't think, but I think just an acknowledgement that you know just life is undefined, and it is not rigid, and not it doesn't fit into nice black and white rules like so many feel like it ought to, or at least seems like they paint everything with black and white rules.
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. I think the two things that come to mind in terms of how we work towards a
Mhm.
solution is we really need, I mean, grace in its original definition. I know that there's a lot of theology behind the idea of grace, but at a fundamental level, grace is really just sort of extending mercy towards someone who's struggling.
Mhm.
And then I think an attitude of grace towards those that are struggling to keep up with all the rules is something important. And a little bit more lighthearted, but also serious, is another practical thing. If any of the social media moderators are out there, please stop deleting posts. Like, let's engage in honest conversation. No one means any harm. We're just, the people out there, they're just really sharing their thoughts. They're being vulnerable, and don't shut them down. At least engage with patience and with charity and try to talk to them.
Yeah, there's this weird, I don't know, fragile sensibility that a lot of Catholics have when it seems like, I don't know, we ought to be able to deal with, confront, grapple with, if you will. Let's just assume they're contrary viewpoints, and I'm not sure they always are. I mean, it's not like it's just in heresy where someone comes in and say, I believe there's only two persons in the person of God, or something like that, or Mary wasn't always a virgin. Although there are things that I think people, not to get too far off track, but Christopher West recently had a episode where he was talking about the virginity of Joseph, and he basically said it. He basically implied it's dogmatic, or it's taught by the church that Joseph was always a virgin, and I was pretty certain that wasn't the truth, and I looked it up, and I'm pretty confident. I mean, that's kind of a traditional view, but the church has never declared that. There's some that say he had children from a prior marriage and he was a widower or whatever, but most of the time people in the Reddit comments are not debating those issues. They're talking about their own experience. I know Adam in the comment mentioned a woman who went on and said she's scared to be a mother, and just got piled on. Oh, that's modernist stuff. Like, and a lot of these people that are commenting, I don't think are mothers, or not, married. It's a lot of single guys or married guys that just are kind of oblivious to what their wives tend to go through, even in, let's say, fairly straightforward childbirth and child rearing.
100%. I think another important aspect of these, the people that are chronically online, and maybe those of us in our community, like in our Uncharted community and the churches that we've been in, is that I think we do exist in a particular section within the Catholic tradition that sort of canonizes too much. It's like, I mean, they've taken a lot of these unofficial things and they've kind of created a maximalist tradition where everything is like what they label as tradition. Everything is mandatory. But I don't know, if you look at the greater Christian tradition, there's a lot of streams of Christianity that emphasize different things. We just happen to be kind of, especially in America, we're lodged in a version of Christianity that's very hyper focused on these things, and with all of the packaged threats and anxiety.
Yeah, and it's almost impossible to find someone that isn't, what's the word I want to use? I mean, just this morning, someone was talking about why they went to St. Pius X Society, and of course, the main reason they do is they didn't like what they were hearing about sexual sins in the Novus Ordo parishes. It's just like, can we just not make that like it just seems to have a disproportionate level of obsession with people versus all the other things that we do or fail to do that I think seem to be at least as important in God's eyes, or maybe more important when it comes to our treatment of our neighbors, and how are we actually hurting other people versus what are you doing in your own bedroom, consenting and all that. And again, I'm not advocating for relativism, but it just seems like, is God really more bothered by what a loving, faithful couple does in the privacy of their own home than he is with what you do when you walk down the street and there's the person holding the sign, homeless, can you spare some change? I find it really, really hard to believe that God cares way more about the one than the other, but that maybe I'm wrong. Don't know.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, but unlike the Reddit mods, we are open to being proven wrong. We won't shut people down if they challenge this view. But I think you're right. The other difficult thing with these topics is I rarely, I mean, I know that some of the most blatant like NFP propagandists will really argue that this stuff leads to flourishing in your marriage. And for some people that might be true. I think maybe it just maybe the physiology and the temperament, it works out and lines up. But I think for most people it's going to be difficult to defend these hardcore traditionalist views from the standpoint of arguing that it'll make your marriage flourish, because
Hmm.
it seems that a lot of the data that we're encountering is that it's not so reliable. Some flourish and some are really under severe strain, and so you have to switch the argument from flourishing to preservation. That, you know, if you don't do this, everything's going to go haywire. You're going to lose your soul. You're going to lose your salvation. You'll be cut off from grace. And then now you argue from a place of fear and preservation, which I don't think is a long term,
Yeah.
it's not really healthy in the long term. I think humans are at their best when they're really motivated by beauty, by flourishing, by pursuing something that's better than where they are. And that's really what like motivates suffering. It's kind of like, I don't know, to use your gym analogy, like going to the gym, that's not always pleasant,
Mm-mm.
but you can see a desired result that's pretty
Mhm.
provable on the other side of going to the gym and putting your body through that strain, because you see the healthy results on the other side of that. You're not going to the gym because you're afraid of going to hell.
Yeah, and and I want to be clear. Like what we're talking about here, is what is morally required, so to speak. And if you violate one or more of these rules, your eternal salvation is at stake. Like that's the context, and we're talking about these things. In no way am I suggesting that. Let's not talk about suffering. Let's even just talk about sacrifice isn't or can't be
Mhm.
beneficial. I mean, I've kind of, people have given me some side eyes when I've, just despite having a podcast about all this stuff, I talk about how NFP has had some benefits to our marriage. And even more recently, the abstinence periods have been, fruitful for us in a way they haven't before. St. Paul talks about, couples can mutually agree to, abstain for a while for prayer or whatever. And, it's like, there's things like 75 hard and stuff like that you can do, that I think can and do build character and virtue and whatever, but those are not required. Those are things that you can, all for people agreeing, like just because you are, even if you're not morally required to, let's say, practice abstaining or something like that for periods of time, there's nothing stopping you from doing it. And it may, in fact, be a good and virtuous thing for your marriage to do that, depending on the circumstances and season of your life, and it being, mutually agreeable. That's the problem. Is these are all things, I think a lot of these things are things that could very well be promoted as virtuous marriage building activities, if you will, or sacrifices. But once they're just set as the standard for even being able to avoid hell, it just totally changes the dynamic, and it adds stress and whatever to the marriage and the relationship that is really, really difficult to overcome. And I think a lot of marriages kind of collapse in on themselves under the weight of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, how many couples are out there like trying to live as cousins or brothers, and it's just wrecking the emotional atmosphere, it's not always just the guys, but I would say stereotypically it's the guys. They end up finding unhealthy coping strategies, or yeah, and whether it's alcohol or looking at stuff you shouldn't be looking at, or seeing someone you shouldn't be seeing, because like the marriage has become a really cold and tense environment, and it's largely due to these things.
Yeah, and I always come back to the fact that this is the environment that these children are raised in. Like, and I'm just telling you, and this is not just my own anecdotal experience. I've been told by other people that even if the couple isn't yelling at each other, and even if dad isn't sleeping on the couch and this and that, even if they're holding it together, so to speak, on the outside, the kids can tell that mom and dad are not embracing in the hallway. They're not stopping for a kiss or a hug or smiling at each other. Even it's kind of a sullen monks walking past each other in the hallway. Kids pick up on that, and that's the part, like, it's impossible to measure that, right?
Mhm.
But that I think, to me, is really the great X factor here that no one really takes into account. And of course we're not allowed to measure the cost or benefit, of however you want to look at it, of these things, because, well, truth is truth and sin is sin, and there's no justification for it. And that's it's a blessing and a curse, right? Like, a lot of people, I think, one of the things that makes Catholicism special is it tends to not waver in the wind. I mean, I've seen, I think we can all see how the train can go off the tracks if you don't have some sort of stability. But stability for the sake of stability doesn't do anything if you're not right, or if you're not somewhat agile about it. And then maybe that's a really hard needle to thread. But the seeming inflexibility of these things to allow us to factor in the unique circumstances of people, or the long-term effects of cold, dead marriages on children and the next generation. I just think it's unfortunate that, like you said, you go on Reddit and you talk about those things and your comments will get blocked. There's literally no room for discussion at all, and that's a problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really frustrating, because it does. I think some of our friends, and I've used this term too, just the idea that it does kind of feel like you're living in a totalitarian state, or at least in terms of how they handle information and propaganda. I don't mean that the church has or the trads have that type of malice to be totalitarian. I'm not impugning motives, but I just mean the methods. Kind of, they do bear some striking parallels to totalitarian propaganda. Like one example that I've come across in the real world is one of the priests that I've mentioned, who's pretty keen on preaching about these things in a pretty, in a pretty severe way. I mean, to his credit, he's never like yelling or anything. He's always pretty soft spoken, but there's a kind of sternness, and he mentions all the things that stress normal Catholic couples out. But he also, after putting all of that stuff putting all of that stuff out there and talking about mortification of the flesh, then he also says that it's important that we radiate joy, because that's the best way to spread the gospel, to radiate joy. And I'm just thinking, I like the punchline of radiating joy, but you didn't set that up really well with everything that came before.
Yeah, it's like, the walls of a fortress, the walls around a castle can serve a great purpose in protecting you from enemies and invaders. But if you can't get out, then it's a jail cell. And now you're no longer being protected from enemies. You're being imprisoned inside. And I think that's how I kind of look at these things to some degree. And maybe, maybe we're looking at all this through the lens of a, 21st century worldview. Maybe there was a time, maybe in Augustine's time, there was actually really good reasons for these rules, and they became let's say, like a protecting wall around the fortress, and not designed to imprison people in. But I don't know what that would be. Like, I'm not sure. Or is we've sort of, I've hypothesized, was it something that folks like Augustine and those that had sketchy pasts, or just had more of a neurotic personality about them, if these weren't really walls for their own protection, but didn't realize or didn't account for the fact that these are serving to imprison other people that aren't dealing with the enemies that they're dealing with.
Yeah. I don't remember where I heard this, but this is regarding an analysis of St. Paul's of views of sexual ethics, and that part of the reason that St. Paul was, um, inspired to preach about, I guess, what we would now term, concupiscence and married couples is better. It's better to get married than to burn, and then these things against lust and stuff and all of that. I do remember reading or hearing somewhere that one of the things that inspired that was that he was living in a very Romanized culture, and he was seeing the excesses of Roman soldiers and how they treated their maybe their wives or their concubines, and in the case of same-sex relationships, maybe one of them was a slave and kind of owned by the master, and I think he saw so much unjust subjugation and objectification of human beings, and so we have to put his teachings in that context where there was also a power dynamic of in these sexual experiences that he was witnessing other people have. There was someone clearly being dominated and whose dignity was under threat. And so that puts it in the context of why he came down pretty hard on certain sexual behaviors, because there was a power dynamic that was really affecting someone negatively in an encounter.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think it's helpful and important to consider those. And as I've mentioned I've tried to mention a lot of times with respect to St. Paul, is as I understand it, and I'm far from an expert or a great New Testament scholar or anything like that, but I studied enough of it in college to kind of know that when at the time of St. Paul, the Lord had just risen or whatever, and there was this assumption for quite some time. I don't know how long it lasted, but there was this assumption that the Lord was coming back soon, like it was within their lifetime. And if you and I grew up with parents, especially a dad that was always the end times are near. This is it, get your bug out bag ready and your holy, your candles and all that kind of stuff. And that's kind of how they lived. And if that's how they lived, there was no real, why would you procreate, or why would you bring kids into that mess, or even have to think about that? And why would you need to be worried about the long-term stability of your marriage? Because you're all soon going to be taken to heaven, where marriage doesn't happen anyway, right? And so that type of, is it called
eschatology?
Yeah,
something like that.
Yeah, that was, I believe that was very much part of it, and I think may have also been part of why there was so many martyrs at the time. I just think it was sort of the the Catholic rapture, I think, if you will, was almost permeating that. And of course we can't just dismiss scripture. I mean, I'm not suggesting we dismiss it, but I think we are still allowed to consider these things or these saints or these certain papal documents within the context of which they arose. And if we don't, and to me, that actually helps. That helps me personally deal with some of the struggles that I have. And to give an example, one of the things I tend to do during Lent is I take up the liturgy of the hours. I try to do morning prayer and sometimes evening prayer. And I'll be honest with you, I really struggle with the divine office, especially some of the Old Testament writings, because they really talk about God, and it's the vengeance on my enemies and all that I really have a hard time relating to, and at times it is, I would say, been detrimental to my faith. But recently I've been thinking about it from the standpoint of, okay, don't consider it from the context of where you live right now, like where I'm not really worried about my family ever starving to death. I'm not worried about someone coming in and invading my land and burning my house and stuff. Like, these are not concerns that I have, but they were concerns, real concerns, that people had in the Old Testament days. And I can see how, a God who, was powerful and king-like was, helpful to them, right? Whereas to me, I find the idea of a king pretty offensive, right? Like I have a hard time, seeing a God in a kingship way in a positive sense, because I don't really think I don't have good opinions about that, right? And so I try to like put myself in the context of which they came, and I also think that it's important for us to try to, because there's plenty of trash online that, we just need a Catholic king again, right? And I'm like, well, I don't think that's going to solve our problem. So I think, I think part of it is understanding the scriptures and understanding early saints within the context in which they live, and also trying to be okay with applying those things, those rules, those expectations within the context of how we live now, which is definitely different. And that's obviously the struggle with Catholicism, is truth can't change, doctrine can't change, and I get that, and I understand the rub, but again, that is sort of the blessing and the curse, the feature and the bug aspect of Catholicism, where we don't change things.
Yeah, no, you're right. Kind of a couple of points, like the thing about scriptural interpretation. And you'd mentioned the rapture. I mean, my parents were kind of odd in that, like, sometimes they'd have these very brief spurts of taking something seriously, and then they'd kind of relax again. And like one of those things was, maybe you've come across the whole 3 days of darkness prediction.
Oh yeah.
And I remember and it was kind of expected around the turn of the century, just like right when the calendar hit year 2000. I remember there was a little bit of anxiety bubbling in the community about that. So that typically does come from like some kind of reading on Revelation, plus probably some like, traditional prophecies that come from saints. But I came across an interesting scriptural reflection from a Presbyterian pastor recently about the book of Revelation, and how that's again another book that we could read in context, that these were Jewish people living under the oppression of the Roman Empire, and the sort of end times speech was kind of, it was less about the rapture the way now it's been portrayed and even sensationalized in the media, and more about like the downfall of Rome's oppressive rule and the rise of the kingship of Christ, in the sense of kind of a new social order where it's rooted not in the pursuit of power, but in the pursuit of loving your neighbor. And then it, obviously it was written in this really poetic and theological language that made more sense directly to the people of the time. And now it's kind of been distorted as we try to force fit it into our current experiences. And now it's become this kind of rapture hysteria. And then the last thing about like, the idea of all the traditional rigidity and the rules is it's rather than those things serving human flourishing, it's sort of now they've become the thing that humans serve, and it's law for law's sake, rather than let's kind of step back and is this having a positive impact on us?
No, I think that's really true. It is very interesting to watch, in the current climate, between the Sedevacantists that I really didn't know was a thing until recently, and now that's all I see in my Twitter feed, but also just with the SSPX thing going on. And for those that don't know, I assume everyone's listening this probably knows, but so Sedevacantists are people that believe that the chair of Peter has been vacant since 1958, when I think it was Pius XII died. They believe there's been no valid pope since then, and they're kind of this secret church, or they're quiet, they're small, I guess they're not necessarily in secret. And then you have the Society of St. Pius X was sort of the stepbrother of the Sedevacantists, who rejected Vatican II, rejected the Novus Ordo Mass and a lot of the Vatican II documents, but still believe in the the validity of the Pope, who may or may not be a heretic, or may at different times. And it's interesting to watch those folks, both the Sedevacantists and the traditionalists, who will give grief to the Protestants, the whoever, for not, getting in line and staying behind the Pope. And yet they're doing the exact same thing. Like, you're always allowed to err on the rigid side, if you will, or the conservative side, or the suffering side. You're never allowed to err on the other side. And so it's interesting to watch that unfold, and for me, what it does is, as I see, and I don't think these are bad people. Like, I think they're very, very well-intended, well-educated people. But if really good Catholics can disagree on whether we even have a pope or whether the Novus Ordo Mass is a valid mass, if Catholics can disagree on that, I think we can, number one, give latitude to Protestants who have had the same struggles, and also for Catholics that find themselves unable to, mentally accept some of these things that we talk about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that rabbit hole that you mentioned about erring on the side of rigidity is so real, because growing up for me, it was sort of the standard bearer was EWTN, especially in high school when I started being more, I was a little bit more conscious about these things, and I was sort of learning to take ownership for my faith very slowly. But yeah, EWTN was sort of the standard bearer, and then you had like Immaculate Heart Radio and Catholic Answers come up, which is kind of still on the EWTN level. And then, the mid 2010s and then into COVID, then I start encountering like Matt Fradd, who's still, like, I would say more conservative than EWTN, but then nothing like, Taylor Marshall and Tim Gordon and Mikey Pantyhose. And then you go like Michael Voris on the, the church militant. And then now you get like the Chad Rippergers of the world and what's a Catholic Esquire, and all of the people in that circle, and then now, the Sedevacantists, the Dimond brothers, who are like super Sedevacantists, and it just keeps going. And then there's I don't know, the dude in Canada, like Pope Michael or whatever his name is. It just never ends.
Yeah. It's an interesting time, and even like, going back to the papacy just a little bit, I grew up under JP2 was the only thing I knew. And, he was far from a traditionalist, but I got the sense that he was not hostile to traditionalists. He probably enabled in some respects the things that traditionalists dislike, but I feel like even the traditionalists more or less thought he was a good man, and he, had this persona about him as just being a really good, holy, pious, loving person. And then, when Ratzinger became Pope, I was still very much a trad at that time, or very traditional leaning. I was like, oh, here we go. We're heading back in the right direction, right? And I know a lot of traditionalists are excited about it. And I think it was Benedict that kind of normalized a little bit the Pius X, did something that kind of removed the schism label and said you can, their confessions are valid, their sacraments are valid, and and there was sort of fresh life breathed into people. And then of course his stepping aside was a very, very unusual thing. And then to have Francis come in, and of course I didn't know who he was before that. And while I was still on the conservative side of things for the most part, I was very fascinated to see how that went, because it seemed like now we're going in a different direction, and until then, the Father James Martins of the world were kind of out there, but they weren't really impacting, so to speak, the church. But now you had Francis, who was the Pope. And of course the trads all lost their minds, and maybe rightly so. I don't know. I'm not really a Francis. I never was a big fan of Francis. I think he did not. I think he had kind of he didn't have that loving, joyful attitude about him that I thought Pope, or John Paul II had. But it was just interesting to watch how this was going to play out, and and I thought it was a mistake for him to go after the trads, although I maybe there was a reason for it, as we've seen how they handle themselves. But and now we've got Leo, who is, I think I think he's closer to Francis than Ratzinger probably, but it's hard to get a good read on him. But we're in a very state of flux, it seems. And I don't know, again, we only have our own experiences. I don't know if this is normal, if you go back into the 1800s, if this was kind of a typical thing. I suspect there was much more of a business as usual when Pope stepped in, and I think there was, I think, and maybe I'm wrong, there wasn't the controversy swirling within the church that there is now. But I don't know. Maybe people know a little better than I do about that.
I think the big practical difficulty we have nowadays, and even especially nowadays, but more so the last 50 years, is just the way mass media is able to transfer information, and everybody can. It's now the papacy and church politics are it's like a spectator sport. Everyone has their hot take on the latest statement, and I even maybe the encyclicals of the past, how fast could you get that out to the peasant class, right? But now it's just you Google the encyclical and everybody, from a politician to a head of a corporation to someone working an entry-level job, everybody can read it and everybody can have a hot take on the latest thing the Pope tweeted or Pope wrote in an encyclical,
Or even old stuff, right? I always love it when you're in a discussion on Twitter and someone will post a link to some, archive PDF document of something a Pope wrote in, 1741. And you're like, okay, well, this is all fine and dandy, but, how did Catholics find this stuff before the internet? And so, again, a lot of this is kind of first world modern problems that we've kind of created for ourselves, that information is so readily available. And then not even to mention with ChatGPT now, it's just literally at your fingertips. You can ask Grok, and Grok is pretty good. If you give Grok or whatever the right thing, it'll tell you what the church has said, or Augustine said, and so now there's not even really I want to say an excuse for ignorance, if you will, if you live in a relatively modern country. Now, there's of course lots of people in the world that don't even have that, but it is, a lot of these are I don't know, busybody problems of prosperous countries, and the whole traditional Catholic movement, I think, is in many ways a rich man's hobby, if you will. It is something that's very much American, I think, and to some extent European, but it is. I don't think it's something that's really catching fire in Central America, South America, Africa, the Philippines. That just doesn't seem to be happening anywhere but here in the Western world.
I think you're right. Although, because of my family's background, I keep track of some Filipino programming, and there is one podcast, the Filipino podcast, that's fond of inviting Father Chad Ripperger. So we might have we might be spiritually colonized by Father Trad pretty soon. Father Trad Ripperger.
Same thing. It works.
Yeah, Chad Trad. Yeah, but you're right though. It is kind of a rich Westerners problem, and in some sense that also adds another funny layer to. That's why it's so easy for them to just say, "Hey, just have a bunch of kids," because maybe these commenters are fairly well off, and they don't know what it might be like to be on. Maybe you're on food stamps, or both parents have to work to make ends meet, But if you're just a rich, comfortable dude with a webcam, it's much easier to be like, yeah, just have kids, just keep having kids.
Yeah. No, well, I think, and not to get too political about this, but it literally came up in a Twitter conversation this morning I had with a SSPX person. But there's two groups of people that I see in the traditionalists. One is they are, relatively affluent people. I'm sorry, when you're sitting around smoking fancy cigars in your studio, and you've got fancy guns on display behind you, that is you're affluent by most standards, right? So you have those people that, like you said, literally can't afford to have as many kids as God gives you, so to speak, and then you have a lot of traditionalists, this has been more my experience, that have large families only because they live in states that have generous, you know, welfare programs for families. And I'm not here to disparage people that do that, but I think there, this is because what I chuckled about is someone was talking about why they left the Novosoro to go to the SSPX. One of the reasons they did it, they didn't like the fact that the Novosoro Church was enabling illegal immigrants to take advantage of the government. And I said, well, does your SSPX parish say anything to the families there that are living on food stamps and state aid and stuff? And again, I'm not here to disparage those people. I'm just pointing out the
inconsistency,
the inconsistency there, that and I think if I don't know that it being eligible for state funding and all that, it means that that's proof that God is giving you everything you can handle, or that you don't have some, let's say, moral responsibility to limit your family size. Because I don't see a lot of them taking we'll just abstain indefinitely and have 3 or 4 kids. A lot of trads want to have their cake and eat it too.
Yeah, it is an odd thing, but I guess it just shows that we're all human and we all have little blind spots that we can't quite see.
Yeah,
I'm just getting caught up here on Adam has a few interesting comments here.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, he kind of makes the same thing about like only because of the internet and the biggest national libraries, like that really does. Yeah, it affects the conversation.
Yeah, and I think he's right. It's a very, very new phenomenon. Like you said, 20 years ago, like the world that I was in as a trad in the let's say the late 1900s, 1990s is very, very different from what it is now. And I mean, we would not have been live streaming about these things 20 years ago or even 10 years ago, I don't think. Right. And so it is, a lot of these things are magnified because of just the incredible advancements in both technology and prosperity. People that are, it's much easier, I think, to become prosperous now, and therefore, like I said, the traditionalists that insist on, going to church in their, their big van and their 3-piece suits, like that is a, I don't know, that like I said, I call those Instagram Catholics more than anything else. There's something they enjoy about the, and again, that is a lot of what traditional Catholicism is. Like the traditional Latin Mass is all the bells and whistles and incense and lace and things like that. And again, I'm not here to say those things are bad, but they all kind of fit a common profile.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up with a Reverend Novus Ordo, so I appreciate too the bells and the incense, like they do add a lot, and I'm quite fond of chant or at least anything that's closer to chant. Nothing against the newer stuff. Like the newer stuff I'm okay with, but I do like that. But you're right, there's a certain pomp and circumstance with all the lace and the gold, and then it's very it's very sparkly for for people claiming rigid heterosexuality. It's pretty sparkly.
Yeah, and I suspect that wasn't the norm, and I've heard that wasn't really the norm. Let's say 60 years ago or 70 years ago, pre-Vatican II. I think your regular Latin Mass parish was, probably was just lots of people showing up because we're supposed to be here, and they're just going through the motions, if you will, and so I just don't think that. It's an oxymoron, but I don't think modern traditionalism is actually a very good reflection of actual traditionalism in most respects.
I've heard that criticism too, that it is sort of a present day misrepresentation of history, or it's a version of history that has too much nostalgia for its own good, and it has some severe blind spots.
Yep. And I don't know. I mean, is this a fad? Is it going to continue on? I mean, if let's say if Rome continues on the trajectory it is, Leo's I don't know how old is he? Do you know? Someone want to
I think he's in
fact
his
check that?
60s.
Yeah.
I can do a quick check. Let's see
Yeah.
what
I mean, he
Oh
could
yeah.
be
Oh,
around.
70s. I guess he's
Oh,
70
so
years old.
okay.
Okay.
He looks good for his age, so
Yeah.
I think he could be around for a while. But what I had heard, I don't know if this is true or just if this is just traditional hysterics, but it sounded like Francis created a lot of cardinals, right? And those, of course, are the folks that are going to elect the Pope, and they elected Leo. And assuming that Pope Leo is appointing cardinals closer in to how Francis did, as opposed to Ratzinger. Of course, Ratzinger's cardinals and John Paul II's cardinals elected Francis. So I don't know what you can, how much you can really predict that stuff. But if let's say Leo has a papacy that is closer in line to Francis, and let's say the next guy is even maybe back closer to Francis. I mean, I don't know how long the traditionalists are going to hold out before they break entirely. Like the Sedevacantists, at least to their credit, like, well, we're not going to try to walk this tightrope of the Pope's the real Pope, but everything they've done since 1958 was basically a screw up. Sedevacantists said, well, no, we're just gonna draw a line in the sand here. And now with SSPX and the controversy over whether they can consecrate bishops, because like I said, under Ratzinger they had more or less had a fairly normalized situation where that is at risk of being changed now or disrupted, and I don't see any indication that a lot of the Society of St. Peter, the Fraternal Society of St. Peter, whatever. I think that was a JP2 or that created that sort of as an olive branch to the traditionalists to get people away from the SSPX. And I think there was a fair number of people that came out and joined the church, or became normalized with the church, if you will. But I think we're in a situation now where people are, the traditionalist minded people are far more likely to just go SSPX or even Sedevacantists than they are to kind of like more fully embrace Vatican II and the Francis / Leo approach to things. I think there's a great possibility there's a real departure, mass exodus from the church of traditionalists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess it was when a lot of the discussions around me when I was a kid, there were a lot of discussions about the effect of Vatican II, and it wasn't something that I can't say I ever really comprehended it until I really encountered the trads and all of the cognitive dissonances they're wrestling with. Like, I guess it must have been really a huge shift, and for them to have to reconcile some of the changes, whether aesthetic or maybe the perceived continuity of certain teachings. There must have been, I don't know. I can't imagine what it must have been to live through it.
Yeah. And I think a lot of them, and even the modern trads, with when we went from John Paul II to to Benedict, I think there was this strong feeling for a time that if we wait this out, the church is going to correct itself. We're going to essentially undo all the Vatican II stuff. We're having all the babies. Like, there is this fertility cult mindset. Let's have all the babies. The normie Catholics are having their 2 kids and getting, sterilized or whatever. And I think there was this growing belief that traditionalism was going to, if we could just hold it together, was going to be the future of the church. And maybe that still could be. But I think we're at a point now where they're not going to stay in the church. They're not going to stay with Rome long enough for that to happen. I think they're either feel forced out, or they're forcing themselves out into more of a Sedevacantist approach, and that'll be very, very interesting to see what happens, because I don't think they're going to wait forever. I don't think they're like, okay, we had Francis, now we have Leo. Let's say Leo is Pope for 10 years, maybe longer, and then another one here. Like I think if they don't see the tides turning in their favor, I don't think they're going to continue to sort of hold their nose and wait this out like they have been for basically all of my lifetime.
Yeah, you're right. There has been at least I haven't really kept track of trad media too much recently. But every
I'm
now and
blocked
then
by all of them, so I really don't get to see what they have to say.
maybe it's better for your mental health for sure.
Probably
But
is.
I know that at least from the few clips I see of Tim Gordon, he's one of the ones that consistently sounds the alarm about Pope Leo being like. But it is funny, like you said, like they'll acknowledge the legitimacy of the office of the papacy and who's currently occupying the chair of Peter, but then it's like but still the Pope can't say or do anything that's correct. So it's kind of, there's a kind of futility about it. But it's like they base their Catholicism really on technical membership under the technical headship of the Pope, who's technically the correct guy, but everything he says and does is wrong.
Well, it's funny because they're like, well, yes, even if the Pius X elects cardinals, it's not a. It doesn't keep them from being Catholics. We're not schismatics. But, oh, by the way, if you think that, if you aren't entirely with the church on the sexual matters, you can't even call yourself Catholic. So you can't be pro-choice and Catholic, right? They're always willing to kick everyone else out of the name Catholic, including us. We get told you should call yourselves Catholic, but they're very, very willing to throw everyone else out for what I consider relatively trivial matters, or at least not as significant as, are you going to follow the Pope or not? And yet they're like, no, we're still good. We are still technically Catholics. This is not a violation of canon law. And I'm like, I don't know. Good luck, guys. I live by the sword, die by the sword.
Yeah, no, these guys. Kind of just going back to Pope Benedict and kind of introducing a bit more hope about things. I also remember it was my dad that was he had the very similar reaction to you when Pope Benedict took over after the passing of Pope John Paul. Like there was a kind of optimism within traditionalists or conservative Catholics that we were moving in a good direction. And I think also under Pope Benedict, it was when the Novus Ordo was more proactively including elements of Latin, and not every single Novus Ordo parish became quite as reverent as like the one I grew up in, but still there were conscious elements of Latin and here and there incorporated, kind of as a part of the universal language of the history of the church. So I remember that. I remember Pope Benedict was almost a kind of traditional icon, although he was very, very soft-spoken and very measured in his language. I don't remember Pope Benedict particularly being an inflammatory person in terms of how he approached things. But even then, when I was talking to David from Once and Future Church, he pointed out that in Spe Salvi that for someone who preferred traditional styles of worship, I think Pope Benedict was a lot more optimistic than all these Massa Damnata people. That he said that as long as we're in Spe Salvi, he was saying that one of the things about salvation is it's open to people who maintain a disposition oriented towards openness to the truth. And I think that's there's something more humane about that approach. That there's a recognition that spiritual growth just looks different for everybody.
Yeah, no, there was something. He was definitely much more of a scholar and academic's the right word, because Pope John Paul II was a prolific writer and reader, but he, I think, think John Paul II was kind of plowing new ground, and Benedict, I think, was a little more like, okay, here's the rules, here's this, but he did not like the limelight. He didn't like, I think Bergoglio, Francis, I think kind of liked the the limelight and the talking and stuff like that. Francis, Benedict didn't really like that, but I think that, like I said, I think if you really read into some of his stuff, I think he had a very good, on a middle of the road, if you will, approach. And I get the sense of Leo is maybe a little more like Benedict than Francis, certainly more so than Francis was. I don't know if you could say Leo is closer to Francis than Ratzinger, but I would say certainly in between them, probably.
I agree. Like there's almost an alternation between like a more outward temperament like Pope John Paul II, and then an inward temperament like Pope Benedict, and then vice versa with Pope Francis being more extroverted. And Pope Leo does strike me as someone who, even though the manner of his speech is very slow and thoughtful and measured, kind of like Pope Benedict, and I think there's a great consideration for how Pope Leo, talks to the media, and all of, and I mean, this is clearly biased, but it's pretty nice to have someone whose primary language is English, and we don't have to deal with the issues of translation when Pope Leo wants to say something to the Western world. There's, we can understand it with no translation, and there's something refreshing about that.
Yep. No, I agree. So I'm kind of anxious to see how this plays out. I haven't been this content as a Catholic in a long time. I was, sort of discontent as a traditional Catholic for the reasons a lot of traditionalists are, and I was kind of discontent as a non-traditional Catholic until a lot of the things that I've worked through in the last few years, and understanding conscience and whatever, and God's mercy and whatever that has, I'm still not, I wouldn't say I'm secure, and I wouldn't say that I don't have some things that kind of keep me up at night, but I feel, I don't know, like I said, I'm more content and happy in my situation now than I probably have been in a long time. So I hope it stays like that.
Yeah, I hope so too. I hope, well, I mean, this is probably not charitable of me to say, but I hope he kind of ruffles some more trad feathers.
Yeah, also, I like seeing that.
Yeah. I like seeing that, but also I hope he just maybe, I wouldn't mind some kind of streamlining of the church. Sometimes I feel like we can get weighed down by so much, and if there could be maybe greater clarity on what's essential and what offers hope, and maybe some of the other things can be relegated to optional traditional practices that may or may not help, but I think it would be nice to have a sort of cleaned up, clear, back to essentials kind of approach to Catholicism.
I agree. I would like to see a resolution of this divide between, let's say, mainstream Catholics and traditional Catholics. I think Francis, for better or for worse, tried to crush that a little bit with his whatever that document was, and I think it failed.
Oh, was it Traditionis? I think Custodes.
Yes, correct, right. Mm-hmm. And so I think that I hope he can resolve it, because I think the longer it goes on, the more damage it does to the church, and they, both for Catholics within as well as observers on the outside. I mean, imagine trying to considering joining the church and being like, what the heck is this? Is a set of if you're a sedevacantist, how do you persuade a non-Catholic to become a sedevacantist? Right? Or even Pius X people, how do you actually convince a non-Catholic to come into the church and, oh, by the way, don't follow the Pope, follow us. And so I would like to see a resolution of these things. And, I don't know. The problem, as I see it, is I don't see the Pope being able to offer a fig leaf big enough that the Pius, the Society of Pius X and the traditionalists are ever going to embrace, and the Pope is never going to like recant Vatican II. So I just I don't know how it actually can get resolved, but I hope that it does.
I agree that I hope that I think we're stronger together, and if we could let go of what all I don't mean to be so dismissive of the trad concerns, but sometimes I feel like a lot of our divisions are really based on things that are so petty in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, and speaking of a little petty, and to go really way back, and then I got to wrap it up because I got to get some work done today. But the only thing I will say that kind of gives me a glimmer of hope is the possibility of the reunification with the East or whatever, with Orthodoxy and stuff. And we see a lot of people in our Discord that talk about Orthodoxy as seeming to have that sweet blend of traditionalism and liturgy, but a little more humanity and pastoral flexibility, if you will, for the marital issues. That if there was a way to thread that needle, if what I want to say, if the Orthodox are kind of what people say it is, I will happily go to a Latin mass for the rest of my life in exchange for that. Like I will follow Ember Days. I will do the Rosary in Latin, whatever. I don't care. You can have all that. If you want your incense and your lace, I'll give you that. If we can have some reasonable development on these moral issues that the Orthodox, well, I don't know that they're perfect, seem to be better. So maybe that, I would like to see that happen, and that is probably more likely to happen. Not that it's likely, but probably more likely to happen than either the traditionalists, essentially embracing Vatican II, or the church I say abandoning Vatican II. I don't see that happening at all.
Yeah, no, I think the best approach is what you said. Yeah, sort of a reassessment of everything we do have, and finding a point of intersection and common ground, so we can strive for more unity.
Yeah,
100%. Well, let's make that our Lenten prayer intention.
Yes. All right, that sounds like a good plan. So I think we're going to wrap it up here. I just checked the comments here. Our social group was always Tradlight, and I always knew we were weird, but as kids growing up, it's been different for them because they're discovering that our Catholic groups are the worst people they've met. Yeah. I again, kind of like it's hard for me to enjoy the Old Testament because of their depiction of God. It's hard for me to embrace a lot of traditional Catholics just because I just don't the impression I get is not good and doesn't seem to be reflective of how I believe the Lord wants us to live. So, but anyway, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. I appreciate you guys that showed up last minute in the comments. We're not great about scheduling and posting these things in advance, or at least I'm not, but it's always fun to get up and talk about these things. And hour can go by quickly. We always have great comments, and then people after the fact, so feel free to leave a comment after the fact. We'll see if we can maybe make this work next week. Maybe it'll be a Saturday or the week after, but we always appreciate you guys showing up, and I always appreciate your beautiful voice and your wise thoughts, Midnight.
Thanks, Craig. It's always a good time with you. It's therapeutic, and it looks like, hey, Saturday mornings looks like it works for a number of people. We had a really active chat. That was really nice.
Yeah, we'll have to make it a thing. So, okay, well, have a great Lent, everyone, and let us know in the comments if there's anything you would like us to talk about. Otherwise, we'll catch you guys all next time.